In a recent video, Alex Malpass and Linford offer a number of objections to my modus tollens argument for the causal principle. Whatever begin to exist has a cause. Now, I won't be replying to everything in their video, not because it's very long, it's about 2 hours, and it's very, very repetitious, right? So they keep repeating the same type of objections again and again, and so there's no point replying to everything they say in the video. Or rather, what I shall do is to reply to the key points in their objections, and that'll be enough to rebut their objections. In order to understand why their objections fail, I'm going to explain my argument first. First of all, let us explain what is meant by the causal principle. Whatever begin to exist has a cause. Now, whatever refers to things, events, properties, states of affairs, arrangements, laws of nature, whatsoever. Events refers to a change. A change is that which involves gaining or losing of one or more properties. Begin to exist refers to having finite temporal extension with boundaries. Say, for example, I began to exist in 1975. So 1975 is the temporal boundary of my existence. I did not exist before that. Okay, so that is to illustrate what it means to begin to exist. And cause here is referring to necessary conditions for making it the case that something or whatever began to exist, right? So these necessary conditions will imply that it didn't come from nothing, right? It came from something which is necessary for the whatever, right, to begin to exist. Okay, so once we understand these terms, let me now explain my modus tollens arguments for the causal principle. This is a simplified version, right, of the argument. Premise 1, if whatever x begins uncaused at any time, then whatever y which begin or could begin to exist around us would also begin uncaused. Why? Because if x begins uncaused, this means that there will be no cause, which makes it the case that only x rather than y begin uncaused. Moreover, any difference between x and y in the concrete world would be had by x and y only when x and y had already begun to exist, right? So any difference between x and y could be, say, for example, any difference between a substance or events or properties, etc., will be had by x and y only when x and y have begun to exist, right? So x and y can refer to substance, events, whatever, right? Because x and y is referring to whatever, right? So any difference between x and y, whatever they are, whether is it talking about events or substance, this difference will only be had by x and y only when x and y had already begun to exist. And so this means that before x and y begin to exist, this difference cannot make a difference, right? So, and therefore, there will be no difference between x and y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, given that they wouldn't make a difference before they begin to exist. And also given that the circumstance around us is compatible with the beginning of y, right? So y is referring to something that begins or could begin to exist around us. Okay, and so this means that if whatever x begin uncaused, whatever y will begin uncaused as well, right? Because there'll be no cause that makes it the case that only x rather than y begin uncaused, and any difference between x and y wouldn't make a difference. Okay, whether x and y are properties, events, substance, or whatever. And so, given that there's no difference, they'll be the same where begin to exist uncaused is concerned. And therefore, if x begin uncaused, y would also begin uncaused. Now, however, it's not the case that y begin uncaused, right? So y can refer to, say, for example, a sudden increase in the strength of electric field beginning uncaused around us and killing us. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened yet, right? Because we are still alive. I'm still alive, you are still alive, right? So we haven't died yet. And therefore, it is not the case that whatever x begin uncaused, okay? Because if whatever x begin uncaused, we should expect y to begin uncaused as well, right? We should expect to experience y, for example, a sudden increase in electric field beginning uncaused and killing me, but that's not the case. And therefore, it's not the case that whatever x begin uncaused. And therefore, this means that whatever x begin to exist would have the cause, right? And so that means that the causal principle is true. Now, let us take a look at Alex Malpass' objections.
You can imagine someone saying that the beginning to exist of my having a headache or something. He says it's purely Pickwickian, an eliminable existence and starting to exist. And we explain what is meant by a headache starting to exist by saying that it just means a head starting to ache.
In that case, he takes a head to be a substance, right? And so he has this substance powers metaphysics where he has the things that exist, that, well, there's substances, and then substances have properties. and then the properties are kind of these derivatively existing things. They exist because they, I don't know, they're had by the substances, and then real beginning to exist is when a substance comes into existence.
Okay, here Malpass is citing a philosopher called Arthur Prior, and the argument is that, say for example, if the headache begin to exist, then this kind of beginning to exist, he think that is Pickwickian, right? Now, what he meant by that is that it is not like talking about a substance beginning to exist. Okay, so the reason why Prior thinks that it is Pickwickian is because he is thinking in terms of substance beginning to exist. Now, however, this doesn't affect my argument because my argument is talking about whatever begin to exist. All right, so it's not limited to talking about substance. My argument can refer to events as well. And so my argument will apply to headache as well, right? So it's not the case that a headache begin uncaused, for example, right? If you have a headache, right, there will be a cause for your headache as well. Let us take a look now at another quotation from Prior.
Prior is saying the head is the thing that existed before the headache came about, and it's properties of the head that explain why the headache began to exist when it did then. So that you can't like kind of you don't get purchase on the too soon or too late argument, because we're sort of sidestepping the construction according to which we're saying that there's a thing that begins to exist, which is my having a headache or something, by just by talking about there being a head which begins to ache. It's then not committed to there being something that's beginning to exist at that point, and then that just means that then you can't fall back on before it existed, it didn't have this property.
Alex Malpass, he is citing Prior here and talking about headache, right? Now, however, again, it doesn't affect my argument because it is still committed to an event, right, beginning to exist, right? The event of headache, right? So not having pain to having pain, right? So from not having pain to having pain, right? The having pain has a beginning. So the headache still begin to exist, right? The events of the headache still begin to exist. And so one can still fall back to saying that, well, before the headache exists, one didn't have the property of having the particular kind of property that is associated with headache, for example, right? That feeling of headache, that property didn't exist before the headache began to exist. And whatever make a headache different from, say, for example, a toothache, right? That also didn't exist either until the headache has already begun to exist. Okay, so one can still make the similar argument, right, for the causal principle. And therefore, my argument is not affected by the objection that Alex Malpass is raising here. Okay. And then in the next quotation.
Right, so Prior says, so look, you could have this kind of limited indeterminism where substances come to have new properties without a cause, and this is which properties a substance comes to have is constrained by the nature of the substance, and so it doesn't have to be constrained by the property, by the non-existent property. Instead, it's constrained by something that does have positive existence, namely the substance. But there's a way in which we can add to this in terms of contemporary physics, which is that now the mainstream view is that what there are fundamentally, at least in our best current fundamental physical theories, are fields, and then and what fields are is they're just distributions of properties over space-time, and everything. So particles, for instance, like electrons, are going to supervene on those fields, and so there's an electron field, for example, and an electron is an excitation, a particular kind of modification of the electron field, right? And so if the object that you have actually, if the substance, if we identify that as the field, or maybe space-time with the field properties or whatever, well then when something like an electron comes to exist, it's not a new substance coming to exist, rather it's a modification of an already existing substance. And so an electron then could begin to exist without a cause, without letting in all of the goblins that these people are worried about, right? Without letting in like raging tigers and whatever else popping into existence out of the void. Here we have an explanation for why those things wouldn't exist, namely the properties of these fields, or perhaps of space-time itself, or whatever, constrains what kinds of modifications they can undergo, and so it would constrain things in such a way that you wouldn't worry about all of these goblins as a worry beginning to exist.
Okay, so here, Linford is talking about something that is regarding a change happening to something that already exists. And Linford's claim is that the pre-existing field will constrain what begin to exist, and therefore things like globins or increase in strength of electric field, these things wouldn't begin uncaused because the pre-existing things, such as the pre-existing field, will constrain and prevent such uncaused events happening. Now, however, I think this objection fails because Linford fails to consider what does it mean to constrain something. Okay? What does constrain means? So in the context of these arguments, constraining is a kind of prevention, right? He's claiming that once you have fields and other things, they will prevent some uncaused events from happening. But what does it mean to prevent something from happening? Now, I actually explained this on page 110 of my book, but Malpass and Linford fail to consider what I mentioned in my book. And so if you take a look at page 110 of my book, which is open access, you can download it for free, you'll find that I explain what it means to prevent something from happening. Now, obviously, something Y cannot be prevented by something else, say, for example, X, acting on the existence of Y itself to prevent Y from beginning to exist. Why? Because if Y has already existed, then it has not in fact been prevented by X. And therefore, in order for X to prevent Y from beginning, X cannot act on Y itself. Why? Because if X act on Y itself, then that means that Y must already begin to exist, right? In order for X to act on Y. But if Y has already begun to exist, then it means that it has not been prevented by X, right? And therefore, for X to prevent Y from beginning to exist, caused or uncaused, X must act on something else other than Y before Y happens. And that means that X must either act on the conditions which are causally necessary for Y to begin in order to prevent Y from beginning, or X must act on the circumstance to make the circumstance incompatible with Y beginning. Okay, so for example, in order to prevent a moving battery-operated toy car from entering a room, I would have to either act on the causally necessary conditions, such as switching off the batteries, such that the toy car wouldn't be able to move, right, to enter the room. Or I can act on the circumstance to make it incompatible with the toy car entering. So for example, I can fill my room with hard objects such that there's no space, right, for the car to enter into. Okay, so these are two ways I can stop, I can prevent, I can constrain a toy car from entering the room by acting on the causally necessary conditions or by acting on the circumstance to make it incompatible with the event happening. Now, however, if whatever X begins uncaused, then what that means is that there is no cause, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin to exist. And additionally, any difference between X and Y will be had by X and Y only when X and Y had already begun to exist. And so what this means is that before X begin to exist and before Y begin to exist, there cannot be any unique characteristics of X and the unique characteristics of Y which makes them different in a concrete world, such that X is not caused to begin to exist, but Y is caused to begin to exist. Since there's no difference, they'll be the same, where the requirement for causally necessary condition is concerned. In other words, given that X wouldn't need any causally necessary conditions, since X is supposed to begin uncaused, the beginning of Y will also not require any causally necessary conditions that can be acted on by X as well. And moreover, the circumstance around me have already been shown to be compatible with the beginning of existence of Y, right? Because Y is referring to something that begin to exist or can begin to exist around me, right? So I'm talking about events such as an electric field increase in strength. We know that such events can happen and do happen very often, right? So for example, if you press a switch on your TV, the electric field of your TV will increase in strength, right? So we know that the circumstance around us is compatible with such events happening. Electric field increase in strength can happen and do happen. And so the circumstance around us is compatible with them happening. And so these points imply that the beginning of Y uncaused could not have been prevented if X began uncaused. Okay, because as I said earlier on, in order for the beginning of Y to be prevented by X, for example, right, X will have to act on the causally necessary conditions for the beginning of Y, or to act on the circumstance, to make the circumstance incompatible with the beginning of Y. But I already explained that the circumstances are compatible with the beginning of Y, right? And Y wouldn't require causally necessary conditions as well if X doesn't need causally necessary conditions. And so what this means is that the beginning of Y will not, in fact, have been preventable, right? There can be nothing that can constrain or prevent Y from beginning to exist uncaused if X itself begin uncaused. And therefore, Linford's objection fails, right? He cannot appeal to any laws of nature or any existing thing to say that, oh, these things will prevent Y from beginning uncaused, right? Because it cannot work, right? As I already explained. Okay, so let us now move on to talk about another objection.
So it's like, actually, when you think about it, the type of beginning to exist where what you've got is something, like root beer just appearing on the table in front of you that didn't exist there before, not made out of anything that existed before, just a new thing out of thin air kind of thing. That type of beginning to exist, let's call it strong beginning, is distinguished from another type of beginning to exist, which is just simply gathering together stuff that already exists, sort of smushing it into a new shape. So like when I bake a cake, I get some eggs and some flour and some sugar or whatever and do stuff to them, and then it's a cake later on. You can obviously, we're going to say, oh yeah, the cake begins to exist, but actually that's Pickwickish as well, a bit like the headache, because really, I mean, it's fair enough to say that it did begin to exist, but really nothing's actually beginning to exist that didn't exist before. Everything that existed after I made the cake existed before. It was just, I've rearranged stuff, baked them and whatnot. But I haven't actually made anything new beginning to exist that didn't exist previously. And actually well, if you stop to think about it, then, there aren't really any plausible looking candidates of strong existence that you can find around you every day. Right? Even your coming to exist is just a rearrangement of previously existing material and stuff and pushed into a new form.
So here, Malpass is claiming that, say, for example, when you begin to exist, it's not as if a new substance begin to exist, right? But rather, it's the form that begin to exist. It's that things that already exist take on a form, take on a certain form, take on your form, right? However, this does not deny the fact that a new form does begin to exist, right? And as I said just now, my argument for the causal principle is not applying only to substance. It applies to whatsoever, right? Whether is it substance, form, events, whatsoever. My argument is saying that whatever begin to exist, including form, will have a cause. And in this case, the new form does begin to exist, and the new form begin to exist due to a cause, right? Something brought you into existence. Something brought your form into existence. Okay, when your father's sperm and your mother's egg, when they meet each other, that brings about the form of your body. Okay, so these events that happen, this new form, it still has a cause, right? And so Malpass distinction between substance and form doesn't actually rebut my argument, right? Because my argument applies to substance and form as well. And then Malpass go on to talk about the difference between ex nihilo beginning of universe compared to change that happen to already existing things. Let us take a look.
In or the beginning of the headache in the head, all of those things are kind of just like changes that happen to stuff that already exists. And so then there's a kind of categorical difference between them, and that's already interesting.
Okay, so Malpass is claiming that there is a difference between ex nihilo beginning of substance compared to beginning of change. Now, of course, I agree that there's a difference, right? That's why I list them separately at the beginning of my argument, right? I say whatever can refer to substance and events which are changed. So I agree, right, that there is a categorical difference between substance and change. However, this does not rebut my argument. Why? Because it doesn't answer my point that the difference between a substance and an event or a change or whatever will not make a difference. Why? Because I already explained that whatever makes a substance or event different from each other, right? Whatever difference will only make a difference when a substance or event had already begun to exist. Okay, so before they begin to exist, they cannot make a difference such that only substance, but not event, begin uncaused, right? And so it wouldn't make any difference to rebut my argument. And so this categorical difference is true, but it doesn't rebut my argument at all. And then Linford goes on to explain that laws are more fundamental than causes.
It's like, if we're going to be having explanations in terms of causes at all, it needs to be in virtue of various laws about what various causal actions do. Various kinds of causal influences, for example, on the field would result in an increase in intensity as opposed to other kinds of causal influences. That to me seems to be something that should just also be able to be explained in terms of laws anyway. And if that's what we say, then it seems like really what does all the explanatory work is not something like a causal principle, but rather just something about laws. And then, then we're in.
Okay, so Linford is claiming that ultimately events are explained in terms of laws. But it still doesn't rebut my argument. Why? Because my argument is that if X begins uncaused, Y would begin uncaused as well. And I already explained earlier, why is it the case that there'll be no law that can constrain, that can prevent Y from happening? Okay, let's continue.
I think what he means is that, like, if the universe began with no cause, it's not that then maybe a tiger would begin to exist. It's that if the universe began to exist without a cause, then, like, inevitably or like without a doubt or something like that. But I think what he's getting to is that, like, I don't know, that like you would definitely see it. It's not like maybe there is a tiger on the other side of the universe or something. It would be right here, right now, in front of you.
Yeah, and I think that's. I've raised this up in a few different places before, a few different places on YouTube. That this is kind of how someone like Hobbes or Edwards thought about this, right? I mean, they were operating in a very different modal theory, and on their view, it's like if there's somehow equal sufficient reason for something to happen, then you would just see both of them. And so if there's just no reason at all that distinguishes two events happening, then you just see both events. And, for Edwards and Hobbes, this is a lot of fun because they think that, well, such a thing like that would be just literally contradictory, right? If for instance, a ball could turn left without a cause, that it could equally turn right without a cause, then it would turn both left and right. That's a contradiction, they would say. Right. And so, in the various places like Hobbes says precisely those kinds of examples about motion. But today, we're working with standard modal theories that I'm aware of today that people find in some way plausible and palatable. We're going to do modal theories under which it's just not true that if there's equal reason for two things to happen, then both would happen.
Okay, so here Linford is raising an objection which is again based on a misunderstanding of my argument. My argument is not talking about equal reason, okay? But rather it is saying that there'll be no difference between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. Now, of course, sometimes having equal reason for two things doesn't mean that both will happen. So for example, we can have equal reason to think that if you throw a coin, it will fall on either head or tail, right? There's a 50% chance that an unbiased coin, for example, will land on head, and 50% chance that it will end on tail. But it doesn't mean that both will happen, right? It is obviously only one of these will happen. So having equal reason for head or tail doesn't mean that both will happen. However, my argument is not talking about equal reason in this sense. My argument is saying that ontologically, given that there will be no difference between X beginning uncaused and Y beginning to exist uncaused, they'll be the same. They'll be identical where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, which means that if one begin uncaused, the other will begin uncaused, right? Because they'll be the same. Okay, so this is not talking about equal reason, but rather is talking about being the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. Okay, so in conclusion, Malpass and Linford's objections have failed to rebut my modus tollens argument. Their objections are based on the failure to understand what does whatever means. Okay. And so they fail to understand that whatever can apply to substance or events or change or properties whatsoever, right? That's the meaning of whatever. My argument is referring to whatever began to exist. And I already demonstrated that any difference between substance, events, or whatever will only be had when substance, events, or whatever begin to exist. Okay, which means that before they begin to exist, they cannot actually make a difference, such that only substance but not event, right, begin uncaused. Okay, and I've also explained what does it mean to constrain something, and explain why, given this understanding, it cannot be the case that there can be any laws of nature of existing things that can prevent Y from beginning uncaused if X begins uncaused. Now, there's a second modus tollens argument, which I offer on page 112 of my book. Now, the second type of modus tollens argument says that if the initial state of our physical reality begin uncaused, then there will be other space-time blocks or universes which will begin uncaused in an unconstrained manner alongside the initial state of reality. And there cannot be any laws of nature before the initial state of reality exists, right? Because it's the initial, right? So there cannot be any laws of nature before the initial state of reality that can prevent, right, these other space-time blocks, which will be substance, right, from beginning uncaused alongside the initial state of reality. And these other space-time blocks will begin uncaused in an unconstrained manner that will crash into our space-time block and totally disrupt our space-time block. Now, that's obviously not the case, right? And therefore, it is not the case that our initial state of reality begin uncaused. And if you want to find out the details of this second type of modus tollens argument, you can take a look at my book. But here, I just want to highlight that all the objections that Malpass and Linford have raised do not apply to this second type of modus tollens argument. Why? Because it is talking about substance consistently throughout, right? By referring to other universe or other space-time blocks which are substances. And moreover, as I said, there cannot be any laws of nature that exist before the initial state of reality, since the initial state of reality is the initial state, right? So there cannot be any laws of nature that exist before it to prevent other space-time blocks or other universe from also beginning uncaused. And so all the objections that Linford raised against my first type of modus tollens argument cannot apply to the second type. And they have not even addressed the second type of modus tollens argument, which I've offered. All the objections they have raised so far is only applicable, right, to the first type of modus tollens argument I offered. And even then, all their objections fail, right, as I already explained. And therefore, in conclusion, Malpass and Linford have failed to rebut the first type of modus tollens argument I offered, and they have not even addressed the second type of modus tollens argument which I offered. And therefore, my modus tollens argument for the causal principle stands unrefuted.